Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to Healing X Outreach. That is Christ-centric. The name of the song is Creed of Nicaea. You can get it off of their Didactic Music CD on their website, christcentric.com. And it's didactic music is music about worship. So, and it's music about theology. And so that's the very name of didactic. It comes from the word didake, or teaching. And so go ahead and pick up one of their CDs. I went to church with some of these guys on Christ-centric, and they've got a lot of music there on christcentric.com. They also hail from Lamp Mode. Even though none of their music is with Lamp Mode, they have their own label right now, but it's good stuff. Next week we have a 12 o'clock show, and we will have, our guest will be Wayne Rogers. He's a former Jehovah's Witness. He's not a Christian. He's an agnostic, and probably leans a little bit towards atheism. I would say he's a weak atheist. But he has a great story coming out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and Wayne is a very good friend of mine on Facebook, a guy who really is trying to learn about mainstream Christianity, and I would say he's open to Christianity. So, but Wayne is I think he's just a very pleasant guy. He got a great beard, and we'll talk a little bit about his beard and much more, his experience coming out of the Jehovah's Witnesses. For those of you, it's Memorial Day weekend, and so this is the weekend where we honor those that have passed away or who have been lost in combat here in the United States, defending our country. And so, we want to honor our wartime vets and those that may still be out there lost. And so, we pray for them and their families, and we thank them and their families for the sacrifices they have made so that we could have the freedom to have this program talking about religion, to have difference of opinion. I mean, that's what this is all about. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two debaters. But I do want to make an announcement. We do have another debate lined up in July 12th, and this is a debate I've been working on for quite some time, and it is entitled, Is Belief in Jesus' Bodily Resurrection Reasonable? And it will be between Dr. Phil Fernandez, who's a good friend of mine, and he debated in October, I think, with a Unitarian, I can't remember his name now, David Barron. Yeah, David Barron. And he will be debating an Aussie atheist, Mark Fulton. And you can read about Mark Fulton at his website. I think it's markfulton.org or .com. And he's also a doctor, but of the medical nature. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two guests. William Albrecht is a Catholic apologist for the Catholic Gate and has a BA in theology. You can see all of his information under our debate advertisement, catholicgate.com. His YouTube is youtube.com/GNR head. And we also have Joey Mccabe, who's a former Jehovah's Witness, currently agnostic, who's asserting the Unitarian position for Justin Martyr. To let everyone know our debate rules. We do have debate rules. We don't allow a lot of overspeaking or anything like that, especially this is probably more applying towards the cross exams. We don't allow any overspeaking during the opening and closing statements. We want to give both debaters the respect to have their time, their fullness of their time, and during their rebuttal periods. But during the cross exams, probably this applies mostly. We know that cross exams are in a question and answer format. The questioner uses questions, and the answer will answer. And so we want. Sometimes we've had in the past where sometimes if there's too much different topics going on, and during the cross exam, our topic, we want to stick to our topics, and that is the topic is did Justin Martyr believe Jesus was a God or true God? And so just want to keep our debates focused and professional. And so there'll be a warning the first time. Second time, there'll be a time subtraction from our cross-exam. And if there's a third time, the closing statement can actually be pulled. So we want to be prepared also for our listening audience to be prepared to ask their questions during the Q&A segment. We're going to have 24 minutes for you guys to go ahead and ask both of our debaters questions. We try to keep it fair, but I know we can't control who the listeners want to ask questions to. Sometimes you get a lot of Unitarians that want to ask William questions. Sometimes you get a lot of Trinitarians that are going to probably want to ask Joey questions. And so just to our two debaters, just let them know that, we don't control who has a question for whom. So Joey and William, are you both on the air?
I am on the air.
I'm on the air too.
Okay, great. I want you guys you'll know when your segment is over, and I'm just going to go ahead and play this little debate ring. This will be the debate ring to let you know that you've reached your time allotment, and when you hear this right here, just try to wrap it up as soon as you can. It's not no hard, fast rules, but try to wrap it as soon before the debate ring ends, and even if it goes a little bit past the debate ring, that's fine.
Definitely.
Don't sweat it. Just wrap it up as soon as you can. So we have, in this debate, we have 2 7-minute openings. We have 2 5-minute rebuttals that would come afterward, and then we have 6 6-minute cross exams, and then we have 2 7-minute closing statements, and then we open up with the Q&A, which is 24 minutes long. Sometimes I'll even go beyond the 24 minutes because normally I just allot 10 minutes for me to make any sparse announcements at the end, and sometimes I just let it eat into that 10-minute period. So I think that William he had sent the debate format, and so we're going to open with Joey Mccabe, and we'll give you 7 minutes as of now.
All right. Well, can everybody hear me all right? I want to thank Augustine and William for allowing someone of my amateurish nature in regards to these subjects to be allowed to come and debate on here. I want to thank all the listeners for joining in on the debate as well. I hope we will be able to make this beneficial for all of us, including myself, being that, I'm still young, I'm always learning. Now what I want to attempt to do is to talk with William and not at him. I'm not a particular fan of professional debates, this being my first. I'm definitely nervous, but if I pause at some parts, I'm just trying to catch up and organize myself. But hopefully we can make this less of a debate and more of a discussion. So first off, I just want to talk about the topic in general. Is God true? Is Jesus? Did Justin believe Jesus was a God or true God? Now it seems that I did kind of misread what was being said in the original statement, but I don't think it really matters all that much because we know what a Trinitarian means when they call Jesus true God. But for me, I just want to talk about the problem here is not whether Justin believes Jesus is a God or true God or not. For I believe both parties affirm the statement that Jesus is a God, and I'm sure William will disagree with me, but allow me to explain what I'm talking about. The real question, though, is whether Justin thought that this God Jesus, this this God, Jesus, is the true God, is true God. Now, I need to explain something. When I refer to a concept in predication as something, I'm calling that concept alone the something that I've predicated it with. So when I call Jesus a God, I'm not calling him a duck or a square or anything like that. I'm saying that only Jesus alone is a God, and that only Jesus is this only God, or whatever I'm talking about in the specific situation. Now, for me, if I may discuss, when a Trinitarian calls Jesus the true God, or true God, they aren't saying that Jesus is the true God in the fact that he's the Father or the being of the Trinity. They're really saying that Jesus is a member of the true God, and is labeled so without restricting any of the other members from being members of that true God. I happen to find this kind of language a tad bit confusing, and I won't be using words like this, and I think it's important to understand that. Like I said, if I call an object something, it should be understood that only that object, or that object alone that I'm speaking of, is the something by which I predicated it with. If I say that the Father is the true God, I mean that only the Father is the true God. If I say that I am my mother's only son, then only I am my mother's only son. I hope everyone can understand this idea of predication. Now, let me just move on to some definitions. For me, there are many ways of defining what we mean by what we say. So let me start by defining what I mean by what I say. And then I'll move on to what Justin understands and how I believe he means what I say. When I say God with a capital G, I mean that all-powerful, almighty being of the universe, the God that created all things and who is worshipped accordingly. When I say true, I mean that though some have proposed others or believe in others of gods of this kind, there is only one true God of this kind, and of this kind is probably the most important aspect of what I will be talking about in my debate. And when I say God with a lowercase, I'm referring to a God in general, or any superhuman agent that gets worshipped. Just to give you an example of kind of what I'm talking about, all apples are fruits, not all fruits are apples. Now let's say there is only one apple. Does this mean that there aren't any other fruits? Of course not. This is the same way I believe we need to understand Judaic monotheism and the concept of Justin Martyr and in the relation of the true God as a God. In order for a being to qualify as the true God, he must be a God. Second, he must be a God of a certain kind. And third, he must be the one God of Christianity. As we know, Islam teaches a God of like kind in comparison with the God of Christianity, but of the two, only one is the true God. I'm talking about this because it's important when we see Justin using language where he calls two different things gods. We need to understand this in relation to what it meant to be a monotheistic Jew of the time. That being said, I'm going to move on to some of the quotes by Justin Martyr that I believe distinguish both agents as one being a god and the other being a god. And then I'll allow myself to be cut off from there. So let's move on to some of the quotes. All right. So in Justin's first apology, the first quotes I'll be taking is to show that the Creator itself, the true God, in my opinion, is a God. And I take this from chapter 10, as I quote, "And as many virtues as are peculiar to a God who is called by no proper name, and we have been taught that he in the beginning did of his goodness for man's sake create all things out of unformed matter." Now, who is this God who has no proper name? I believe it's the Father, God the Father. And I say this because what Justin says in chapter 61 and other places in his apologies, where, quote, "The name of God the Father and Lord of the universe, no one can utter the name of the ineffable God. And if anyone dare to say there is a name, he raves with hopeless madness." So here I think it can be said that not only is the Father the God in reference to chapter 10, but that the Father is a God. He is God in that he is the supreme deity, the creator of all things, the eternal God, the unchanging God, but he is a God nonetheless. Now I want to stress just how important I feel it is to identify each God in relation to each other, where we read in chapter 13 of his first apology, "And that we reasonably worship him, having learned that he is the Son of the true God himself, and holding him in the second place." it says, for they proclaim our madness to consist in this, that we give to a crucified man a place second to the unchangeable and eternal God, the creator of all. For they do discern the mystery that is herein, to which, as we made it plain to you, we pray you give us heed. This is a quote which, in my opinion, displays two important points. One, that Jesus was worshipped not as the true God, but as the Son of the true God. And second, because this needs to be understood in light of the pagans of the time, who were mad at Christians for placing another person or being who they thought to be a mere man, second to the unchangeable and eternal God. The hard part about this is, does Justin think that they've been misrepresented? I do, in a part, believe that they've been misrepresented, but I also believe he affirms that Jesus is second to this unchangeable and eternal God. It's just, who is this Jesus? So for me, the mystery isn't that Jesus is, in fact, only second in rank, and that he himself is the unchangeable and eternal God and creator of all, but that, as Justin teaches us, that Jesus isn't just a mere crucified man, and that this man born of God is born of God and called God because he ministers for the unchangeable and eternal God the Father, and is allowed to receive worship and honor and praise because it's the will of his Father. I'll end there right now just to show the distinction between the two, and I will allow William to go on with his opening statement.
Okay, thank you so much. And William, you can have your opening statement as of now.
Thank you very much. Today's debate centers around church father, around the patristic giant, Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is a forerunner of the Nicene and post-Nicene theology, a gigantic figure that stood at the forefront of orthodoxy in his day, and his writings really don't age. And in fact, it is scholar Parvis that tells us of Justin that his place at the heart of history of Christian apologetics is well established, going as far as saying that he is the tradition's founder. Scholar Rebuttal tells us that Justin was one of the most staunchest defenders of the Orthodox doctrine of the deity of Christ, and that this was not just scattered throughout his writings, but found explicitly in many places. Rebuttal tells us that Justin's claims about Christ's divinity are extremely important. I agree wholeheartedly. Ludwig Ott, of the classic tome Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, tells us that Justin was part of the ancient Christian church's testimonies from tradition that gave evidence to the deity of our Lord Christ, not to a type of deity or to evidence of him being a deity. No, let us be clear about one thing. Christ is God. Jesus Christ is eternal God. And Justin's works are frequently quoted by the Nicene Fathers, but what should interest us even more is how Orthodox Fathers viewed this pillar of our beautiful faith. Tatian called him the most admirable among the patristics, quoted him frequently. Irenaeus, Methodius, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Eusebius, Augustine, and various others relied on many of his apologies in their evangelism. Today, in the ancient Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, we celebrate the feast of the great Justin Martyr. So was this giant of ancient history one that believed that our God was indeed true God, or just a God with a tiny g? Today, there are a few points that I believe will be key in showing that Justin indeed did believe that Christ was true God. We will examine a few points, and some of the main points will be whether or not, one, Justin believed Christ was God or a God. Two, did Justin believe Christ was eternal God? Three, what about the passages in which Justin seems to denigrate Christ? Four, is his exegesis consistent with Christian exegesis to show that he believed Christ was the eternal true God? Does he utilize the Septuagint text to show a thoroughly Christological teaching that in turn shows he believes Christ to be true deity? Do any early fathers ever condemn Justin as being unorthodox? And maybe, quite possibly most importantly, do any Arians or semi-Arians ever seize upon Justin as evidence for a teaching of him not believing Christ was true God? Justin is never vague when he tells us that the Son is Theos. In his first apology and in his dialogue with Trypho, he tells us that Christ is Lord and God. The Son, as God, is strong and to be worshipped. The key word used here in the Greek by Justin is proskuneo, for worship. And let me add one thing. Justin was careful and calculated in worship, in his usage of the Greek word worship, and he never, ever uses this Greek term ever for any other than the true God. In fact, he tells us that in his writings. He goes further by describing how Christ should be worshipped. For he is deserving to be worshipped how? As God and as Christ. He tells us how the God-man was crucified and has been set forth expressly as God and man. Really no wonky way to interpret the Greek here. He is set forth as God and man. He then tells us how the prophetic word calls him God. What is striking in Justin is his application of the historical text to Christ when he tells us that it was the Logos who spoke to Moses in the burning bush, saying, I am that I am, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and the God of the fathers. The Father of the universe has a Son, who also being the first begotten Word of God, is even God. For they who affirm that the Son is the Father are proved neither to become acquainted with the Father, nor to know that the Father of the universe has a Son, who also being the first begotten Word of God, is even God. And one thing I have to note that I simply will not go into Greek detail about, because I do not have the time, is the Greek usage of Justin's theos in reference to the weos, the Son. I've heard this argument brought forward by many of the Unitarian persuasion, and they have claimed that in this passage, Justin really means that Christ is a God, and that the Greek can be translated that way. Well, even if we were to grant that in this passage or certain passages, which we won't, Justin's usage of theos and God connected text is so common and calculated that this type of argument is amateurish at best. Justin goes on further to tell us that our teacher of these things is Jesus Christ, for also was born of this purpose and crucified under Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the times of Tiberius Caesar, and that we reasonably worship him. That this referred to Christ, and you maintain him to be pre-existent God and having to become incarnate by God's will to be born man by the Virgin. What about the second point we had brought up? Isn't it logical that if Justin were to believe Christ was true God, that he would also believe his generation to be eternal? Absolutely. Justin tells us regarding the generation of the Son. And just as we see also happen in the case of the fire, which is not less than what has been kindled, but remains the same, and that which has been kindled by it likewise appears to exist by itself, not diminishing that from which it was kindled. The Logos, the Word of wisdom, who is himself this God, begotten of the Father of all things, and Word and wisdom and power and glory of the begetter, will bear evidence to me. Take in mind that this whole chapter is dedicated to the generation of the Logos, the generation of the Word, the generation of Christ. He uses an example of Christ when he says that fire is not lessened when it comes about. In this case, when Christ came to earth in human form. So his analogy is that this fire existed in some form before it came to earth in the human God form. It pre-existed. And he is clear in saying that this fire remains the same. So it's telling us that Christ existed before, and now he comes in human form, and since he is God, he remains the same. We know this because the following example, he tells us that the Word of wisdom, who is himself this God. Okay, that this is the kind of God that Christ is. His generation is eternal because Justin believes he was sent by the Father just before the creation of the world. And as we will continue to examine this passage, we will see more passages in which Justin not only believed in the eternal generation of the Son, but he definitely and wholeheartedly believed that Christ was eternal, true God. And I will now conclude my opening statement and give way to Mr. McCabe's rebuttal period.
Very good. Yeah, that was a little bit before the time allotment. So we will now begin with a 5-minute rebuttal period for Joey McCabe, and then a 5-minute rebuttal period for William Albrecht, and then we'll begin the cross exams. And Joey, you can begin with your rebuttal period right now.
All right. So we heard a lot of stuff on the deity of Christ, the divinity of Christ, Christ as God, Christ worshipped as God. Here's the thing. When I make the case of Jesus not being the true God, I'm not denying his divinity. I'm not denying his deity. I'm not denying that he's worshipped as God. I'm not even denying that. The fact of the matter is, what does it mean to be deity? What does it mean to be divinity? What does it mean to be worshipped as God? Like I said in my opening statement, what is it that, how do we worship Jesus? Do we worship him as the true God, or do we worship him accordingly because of the will of the true God? Now, a lot of people would say, oh, well, only God can be worshipped, and this and that, but my response to that would be that when Jesus said to Satan in the wilderness that it was to God alone that you must render sacred service to, there's a reason he didn't include himself in that label, because Jesus is not to be worshipped as if he were the Father, or as in the same way that we worship the Father, but that alone the Father is to be worshipped. Now, I'm sure a lot of Trinitarians would say, well, no, it's talking about God in general, and Jesus is just distinguished in third person. But I think that the text clearly shows that in both of our cases there seems to be a little bit of a problem where the text says that only the Father can be worshipped. So, that being said, what does it mean to worship Jesus? It's all by the will of the one true God that we come to worship Jesus. Jesus is called the one true God because it's the will of the Father. Now, if I will, I'm going to quote a third-party source that I believe shows this in the best way. It's from a book. One second. A book on Justin Martyr, his life, writings, and opinions. And I quote as follows. It's a little bit on the long side, but I think that it properly expresses everything that we've come here to really discuss. So I quote, "This relation of subordination is expressed by Justin distinctly and under various aspects. He briefly indicates it when, as in several occasions, he assigns the Logos the second place after God. Thus, when he says, 'We shall exhibit Jesus Christ, in whom we acknowledge the Son of the true God, and to whom we assign the second place, and with reason honor the perfect Spirit in the third rank, and we adore and love after God the Logos that is from the unbegotten and unutterable God, and the first power and Son after the Father of all and Lord God is the Logos. And the Logos, then, whom we have no ruler more royal and more just, only after God begat him." The sense in which Justin believed that the Logos was subordinate to the Father is twofold: that of complete dependence on the true God, and of a quantitative inequality of being. Justin considers the Logos as dependent on God in respect of his rank, his existence, his power, his worship, his agency. All that the Logos has is a gift from the Father. He is God because it's the will of the Father. He is powerful, yet Lord of the heavenly hosts, because God made him so. He receives divine honor because God has ordained it. In all things he stands below the Creator of the world. To him he is subordinate, not merely as Father, but also as Lord. He is the instrument of a higher will. Justin expressly terms the Logos a servant of the Creator of the universe, not so much in relation to creation and universal enlightenment of the world, as in the reference of the Old Testament theophanies in which he appeared in God's stead to teach and act, to bless and punish. So I think that this is extremely important to understand, that everything that Justin calls Jesus is because of the will of the one true God. Now, this is kind of what I would expect to see if Justin were in fact a separate deity who is not the true God, but is called God because he's allowed to be called God. In this way, I can affirm Jesus is God. And I'm sure that's interesting for any Unitarian to say. Jesus is God only because the Father allows him to carry that title. But as we know from what it means to be the true God, that only the Father is truly the God. And I'll let William continue from there.
All right, William, you can begin with your 5-minute rebuttal period right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Mr. McCabe. And I'll start off by going over a few things that Mr. McCabe said and, in his opening and right now in his rebuttal period. He went over the point that he says that only God should be worshipped, and then he goes on and implies that, I don't know, in some way that Christ might be eternal, all-powerful, and that he says that all attributes that Justin gives to Christ are from the Father, and then he seems to imply that Christ isn't eternal. I'm going to try and go ahead and follow the logic here, but then he says that we don't worship Christ as true God. Well, I want to go right back over the passage in which Justin is telling us that he definitely does believe Christ to be true God, and he speaks about the generation of the Son. And taking in mind that the whole chapter in which he's comparing the fire is dedicated to the generation of Christ, and he tells us that he uses a really good example here by saying that fire isn't lessened when it comes about. Of course, he's referring to Christ having pre-existed, and then he comes to earth in his human form. He then tells us that the word of wisdom, who is himself this God. Okay, but the thing is important to realize, what kind of a God is Christ? Is it a different kind of God, or is it a lower kind of deity, as Mr. McCabe is implying? Well, it really isn't, because Justin's telling us his generation is eternal because he was sent by the Father just before the creation of the world. And then it goes about by telling us, does Justin mean that he was created or came about? No, Justin says that his source is deity, and his source does not change and remains the same. And if Mr. McCabe's point were to be true and would not be true God, Mr. McCabe has a really, really big problem, because Justin uses the Greek word menontos in this passage here in regards to the generation of the Son. And this Greek word menontos is really, really important, because here he's telling us that Christ doesn't change. Christ has eternally been the same in his source of deity. Obviously not in his human form. In his source of deity, Justin believes Christ to be eternal God, and in that sense does not believe that he changes, period. It's really important to keep that in mind when we speak about this, because a lot of this is lost. A lot of this terminology really is lost. And Mr. McCabe goes on to speak about Justin talking about the subordination in regards to the deity, in regards to Christ, period. First off, one point we really need to make from the outset is Justin differentiates between the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost as well a load of times. I don't even remember how many times. I lost count. And we really want him to. I mean, why would we not want him to say that the Son is the second person of the Trinity? We need him to say that, because as Orthodox theology is the one thing that we need to realize Justin is saying is, and many notes even noted and point out that in many chapters, Justin affirms a sort of filial subordination. And the point is that the Son was begotten of the Father, but he says specifically without dividing the substance. So it is assumed that the Son is God of God, but though inferior to the Father because of the cause of his generation. And, it's gone over multiple times what Justin means by that. But what needs to interest us even more, and is really important, is that worship is to be given to God alone, Mr. McCabe says. And Jews believe that worship is to be given to God alone. We agree with that wholeheartedly. And we think that Justin agrees with that as well. Because in chapter 19 of Justin's first apology, he says, and this is really important, because if Mr. McCabe is going to want to say that we can worship Christ, and then that Christ is not true God, he's got a real big problem here. Because Justin says that we ought to worship God alone. Pantheon monon, God alone. And he goes on to say that this is the greatest commandment. You shall worship the Lord your God and him only. So whether he wants to say Christ is a type of deity or, a lower type of deity, I don't know what he really wants to say. He's got a big problem here, because Justin only believed that you could worship God alone, the true God. And he tells us right here in chapter 19 of his first apology. And yet he follows that up by telling us that Christ is to be worshipped as God in his chapter 76 of the very same work. Christ is God and is to be worshipped. So my question, well, I can't pose it yet, but question really has to be posed here. Who's to be worshipped? God alone, but Christ is also allowed, even though he's like a tiny God, like a tiny G. He's a God, a lesser God. Well, I'll conclude my rebuttal statement there and give way to Mr. McCabe's cross-examination.
Okay, we're going to open with six-minute cross-exams, and Joey, you'll be cross-examining William Albrecht.
All right. All right. So I want to bring up this your last point, Will, about worshiping God, and it's to God alone that we should worship. Now, my question to you is, when we say that statement, and I said this in my rebuttal, does which God, capital G, is being talked about when we say only God can be worshipped?
The true God. Justin believes that basically what Justin's theology is this: only God and God alone is due worship. And in his apology, chapter 19, and a few chapters before that and a few chapters that follow that, he goes on to call it extreme idolatry to worship anyone other than the true God. So in Justin's theology, he believes that it is God alone. I know he doesn't use the word true God alone, but he's really clear when he says that the only God, only true God alone, only the real actual God is to be given latria, true worship. So in his theology, it's going to be God alone that deserves worship.
Okay, yes. So what you're essentially saying is that that God in this context is, if anything, the duality between Jesus and the Father. But what I'm trying to say is, especially when it comes to passages where Justin, as I know anyone would believe, was quoting from the New Testament, where Jesus, in a response to the devil, says, "It is to God alone you must worship, and it's to Him alone you must render sacred service." Now, is God in this reference a him, or is it a they?
Are you implying that there are multiple deities? I know it's not my time to ask questions, but I'm kind of confused. Are you asking me a question in reference to one of Justin's works, or are you asking me a question in regards to the Bible?
Well, because I'm not asserting that there are multiple deities in your own position. What I'm asserting is that there are multiple persons in your own position.
Okay.
In which case I would say which him is being spoken of, or which is it they that's being spoken of, where we can worship God alone, we can worship them alone, the persons that make up the true God.
Yeah, I don't really understand the question, because I'm curious if you're, again, I know I can't ask questions, it's your cross-exam time, but if you could clear it up for me and let me know, are you referring to something Justin wrote or something from the Bible, or are you just asking me a straight-out theological question?
I'm kind of asking a straight-out theological question, but I'm also asking it in reference to how Justin quotes it from the New Testament. If you could quote it for me where Justin says that, I mean, I can go ahead and deal with it in context a lot better. I mean, I think that would help our situation a lot better. Yeah. You quoted it yourself, where it says that it is to God alone that we.
Oh, I see. Okay. I think I got the point of your question. I think what you're trying to ask me is if in this chapter 19 where he says that we should give worship to God alone, if he's referring to the Father specifically here, or if he's referring to the Son as well, like both of them, or just one of them. Is that what your question is?
Correct.
Okay, that's a really good question, actually. Thank you for that. I think it's really clear in Justin's theology that he uses the term theos for God the Father, and he uses the term theos for God the Son, as well as for the Holy Spirit. I know we're not talking about the Holy Ghost today, but his usage of theos is always qualified. He's always really calculated and clear in what he's trying to say. And in this passage, he's telling us that we should worship God alone. The greatest commandment is to worship the Lord your God. And I believe, as Justin shows, in this very same work, as we read a few chapters later, and I'll pepper it all throughout the work, is that he believes that the true God was the Father and the true God was the Son. So if he's saying that we should give worship to God alone, he's definitely including the Son as the second person of the Trinity in this passage.
Okay. So in that, would you agree that this is a quote or an allusion to the New Testament passage where Justin says that is to worship God alone, where Jesus says it?
I think it's almost a direct quotation from the New Testament.
Okay. So that being understood, when Jesus calls the God that is to be worshipped alone a him, why does he refer to it as a him as if it's a first-person singular, in a first-person singular context, when he really should have included himself if he had meant that?
Are you referring to a certain biblical passage, or are you referring to...
Now I'm referring to the biblical, like what I just said when I said, is Jesus... In relation to Justin making the statement, is he quoting from the New Testament? If he's quoting from the New Testament, then let's go into the New Testament and see exactly what's said in the same way, because we understand what Justin says based on what the New Testament says and how he understood it. But I want to say, what I'm asking is, why is a third person singular pronoun used in relation to the God that's to be worshipped alone, when in fact, if your case is true, that it should be a plural personal pronoun, such as we or us?
Why would it have to be plural? That's not how Greek works. In order for it to be plural, there are many passages in which the Holy Trinity is mentioned, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and we're given a singular, a name, to refer to all three. So that's not a mandate of biblical Greek. It doesn't need to be in the plural form. I mean, that really doesn't make much sense. I don't really understand the argument, because biblical Greek doesn't require that type of a rule.
Well, besides the fact that I believe that that scripture in Matthew was a later addition to the biblical text, but okay. It seems that my time is over for asking questions, so go ahead, William.
Yeah, you might. Maybe you could pick up on that when your cross-exam comes back around, Joey.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Just hold your spot on that, and just be prepared for William to ask you questions. William, you can begin your 6-minute cross-exam now.
Great. Okay, Mr. McCabe, I'm going to go ahead and go right back to chapter 19 of Justin's first apology. And again, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm not even going to go into the New Testament. I'm going to stick with Justin alone.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, in this chapter 19 of his first apology, where Justin says, and that we ought to worship God alone, he thus persuaded us, the greatest commandment is, you shall worship the Lord your God. Is Justin referring here in this passage to the true God? I know maybe in your opinion it might be the Father or whatever, but is Justin referring to worship in regard to the true God alone here?
Yes, he is most definitely talking about the true God.
Okay. So Justin's theology is saying that worship is to be given to the true God alone. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. Moving forward to his first apology, same work, chapter 76. Could you read out that passage chapter 76 where it says, and David predicted? I don't know if you're there. That's why I want to make sure you get there correctly. Are you there?
Give me 1 second. Also, I just want to clarify what I meant by saying yes to that other part of your last question. You said 76, right?
Correct, yeah.
Hold on, let me just get there, and then I will explain what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, goodness.
Well, let me go ahead and read it out loud as you're looking for it.
All right. Well, let me just explain myself in a little bit in a different manner before we just to clarify the answer to the last question. Sure. When you ask me if it's to the true God that alone that we should worship, I believe that statement is made in relation to how this true God is worshipped, and not exactly to the name, the word proskuneo. Because as we know, proskuneo in the Bible does refer to many things, including the kings. It includes the apostles. The apostles would be proskuneoed. King David is proskuneoed in the LXX. So I think we need to understand that what Justin means when he says the word worship, and when it refers to the only true God. And in that regards, I think that we can only worship the only true God in the highest sense of the word, where there's a semantical sense structure to the word proskuneo. It's hard to make this clarification in English because we only have one word, and we have many words and they have only one word. So semantical differences in that regard are we could actually name it, where worship, and then you see serve, obeisance, everything like that. So whenever I see that the only true God is proskuneoed, we can translate it accordingly as worshipped. And in that regard, Christ cannot be worshipped. But Christ can be proskuneoed in that he can be done obeisance to. So that's just what I wanted to make clarification about that word proskuneo.
That's actually a fantastic point, and I really, really appreciate you bringing up that point, because I actually am going to divert the question that I was going to ask you for a moment from chapter 76, because you want to go into the Greek word proskuneo. It's really important that I ask you this next question. Are you aware that Justin Martyr never once uses the word proskuneo for anything other than worship, that he strictly keeps that reference to worship?
I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
I'm speaking in reference to Justin Martyr. Have you studied his usage of the Greek proskuneo? I'm not speaking about the usage in the Septuagint or the New Testament. I'm speaking about how Justin uses the word proskuneo. Are you aware that he restricts that usage to worship alone? In other words, you're not going to see Justin say that you're going to give a sort of proskuneo to a king or to a human or to a mere messenger. He restricts the usage of proskuneo to deity alone, and then later ties that into idolatria if you give proskuneo to anybody other than the true God. Were you aware of that?
I was not. It would be nice to see where you find Justin limiting worship of that kind to the Father. I mean, to the true God. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. What I can go ahead and do for you, because it would be irresponsible if I don't, I can provide you a list after the debate or later on, if I get time during the debate, of every single time where Justin uses the term proskuneo in this whole apology. And as you can tell in chapter 19, when he says that ton theon monon dei proskunein, he's referring to worshiping God alone in chapter 19. We go right down to chapter 76, and he says, he uses the exact same, a different form, but the exact same word for Christ. So that's pretty much why I wanted to ask you, in chapter 76, who is Justin telling us is to be worshipped here?
Okay. Well, I would actually beg the question of saying that that the assumption is so far that Justin limits the word of proskuneo to just the true God, and I think that that's based on the fact. I believe that that's a biased interpretation, because you believe that Jesus is the true God, and you're attempting to show that Justin only applies the word worshipped in that context. But I do believe I will stick by what I said before, unless it can be changed, unless I can see the evidence of this sort of exclusivity that you believe Justin ascribes to proskuneo.
Okay.
I just want to say that was a little bit of a violation of the rules, so I just want to apologize. But William is not supposed to be asking you questions during your cross-exam. Oh, no, this is William's cross-exam, though, right?
It's my cross-exam. Yeah, it's my cross-exam.
Oh, okay, my bad. All right, go ahead. Proceed.
Okay.
So, William, I will, this is not to push this question off as anything. I definitely will look into this, but it probably would be best if you moved on to your next question. Oh, well.
I think it's your turn.
Actually, now it's your turn. My bad. I lost track of whose cross-exam it was. So now it's Joey's cross-exam. So, Joey, you got 6 minutes to cross-exam William.
Okay. So let me just look at some stuff that I wanted to talk about. Oh, okay.
You were talking about a certain point before you ran out of time. You can pick up on that if you want.
Yeah, I was talking about proskuneo and its reference to the true God. Now, I believe that when we call the Father the true God, like I said in my opening statement about predication, and how we normally understand the English language and other languages, where predication involves a subject being described as something. So when the Father is described as the true God, there are two assumptions that I'm making, where that the Father is a God, and a God of a certain kind, and that He's the only one of that kind. That's basically what I am saying when I say that the Father is a true God, and only the Father is the true God. And that's by necessity what I'm saying, and I hope you understand what I mean. Why I'm saying this.
I completely understand you, but you're going to have to phrase that in the form of a question for me to reply to that.
No, I'm backing up what I'm saying to reference a question. So when you call Jesus the true God, what keeps you from calling Jesus the Father by this understanding of predication?
In regards to Justin's works, since we're debating Justin,
what I'm doing now is really just defining terms in regards to how about how we understand them, and then I'll move on to what I believe Jesus believes about the true God. But I just wanted to define some things, because I feel like we're talking over each other when it comes to what it means to be the true God, stuff like that.
Okay, so let me try and go ahead and give you a really, really brief answer to that, so that you can go ahead and get your other questions in.
Okay.
Trinitarian theology is it's very deep. I think that Gus will agree with myself, and anybody listening is going to agree. It's deep, and there's no way that I'm going to do it justice by giving you a brief, tiny example. But let me try and tell you that I believe the exact same way Justin believed in reference to what he says about Christ. He believes the Father was true God, definitely. And he believes the Father was eternal, of course. His theology in reference to the Son is that the Son was eternal. He tells us that he believes that he existed in his substance of deity eternally, and he then tells us, and actually I'll go ahead and I'll describe what I believe of Christ in the exact same way that Justin does. He tells us that he believes that Christ, I'm trying to look it up. He believes that Christ is, there we go. He's really clear when he tells us that Christ pre-existed and that he remains the same. I found that really shocking in a really good way when I was reading Justin's works, because when he tells us that Christ has pre-existed and he remains the same, his theology on the eternal generation of the Son, whereas not fully developed as it was developed in later times, it's real clear. It's in seed form there in the early church. It's really clear. And it's not from Justin. I want to make that clear for anybody listening. This isn't Justin's theology only. This is the theology of the early church that was well known. So I believe Christ to have been eternal God, and I believe the Father, of course, to have been eternal God. And, of course, even though we're not debating the Holy Spirit, I believe the Holy Spirit as well to be eternal God. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a brief glimpse into what my theology is.
Yeah. If I'm okay, let me move on. And this is just in terms of we're just defining terms actually, where I'm trying to understand what you mean by true God, a God, everything like that. So essentially, you're saying that Jesus is not the true God, aka the Trinity, but he is true God in that he shares the nature of the other persons. Correct?
Jesus Christ, actually, that would be incorrect. Jesus Christ is true God, but I would differentiate in the sense that he's definitely not all three persons of the Trinity. So in that sense, I would definitely disagree. He is true God, but one thing that needs to be clear is that he is not the Father. And in one point I want to make, I know we might not even have enough time to go over, so I want to quickly go over it, is Justin at times is really, really clear in differentiating between the Father and the Son to an extreme level. And in that sense, I'm going to have to say I agree that they are two completely They're distinct persons. The Father is the first person of the Trinity, and the Son is the second person of the Trinity, and both are true God.
Okay. Now, what I do find interesting is your use of the English language in contrast to how, or the Greek, I guess, in contrast to how Justin describes God. He doesn't call Jesus or the Father true God. He calls Jesus and he calls the Father the true God, which means that this isn't we're not talking about a sort of substance. We're not talking about an essence. Where I call something when I am flesh, right? I am not the flesh. I am flesh, meaning that I am of flesh. I share flesh with my fellow fleshly members. So why does Justin use an article?
Yeah, you can ask me that in your next class.
You might want to ask that on the next class.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. All righty. William, this is your second cross exam, and you can begin now.
Okay, great. Mr. McCabe, I'm going to go right back to where we were a little while ago, chapter 19, and I want to go real quickly because I got a lot of other questions I want to ask you. Chapter 19, where Justin says that we ought to worship God alone, and then he says that the greatest commandment is you shall worship the Lord your God. I am confining myself to Justin's works. So then going down to chapter 76, I want to real quickly read it for you. The portion I'm relating to says, and David predicted that he would be born from the womb before sun and moon, according to the Father's will, and made him known, being Christ, as God, strong, and to be worshipped. My question to you is real simple. In chapter 76, who is to be worshipped here according to Justin Martyr?
Well, I'm just trying to find it myself.
Right. He says Christ as God, strong and to be worshipped.
Okay.
Is he saying that Christ is to be worshipped here?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess let me tie them both in together with you. Since you say that Christ is to be worshipped here, and in chapter 19 of the same work, Justin says that God alone is to be worshipped, is it then logical to assume that since only the true God can be worshipped in Justin's theology, that this entails that Justin viewed Christ as true God?
I would say I'm sorry, you have to answer your question again. Just ask that question one more time.
Okay. Since you have agreed that chapter 19, Justin says that we should worship God alone, and you have agreed that chapter 76, Justin says that Christ is God and to be worshipped, is it then logical to assume that in Justin's theology that Christ was true God? Since in chapter 19 he says we should only worship God, only God alone, and then chapter 76 he tells us that Christ is to be worshipped. Is it then not logical that Christ is true God in Justin's theology?
Now, if I may ask just a tiny question, is the definite article in this passage in 76?
In chapter 76, in regards to what?
In regards to God.
In regards to Jesus as God?
Yeah, where you said that Jesus as God is to be worshipped. That's one of the. Is that you're quoting directly from 76, right?
Definitely. Are you referring to the definite article being ha theos? Is that what you're trying to imply? No, it doesn't say ha theos. Are you implying that the definite article needs to be here in order to tie in the Greek word kai with Christon? I mean, we've got the Greek word tying in. I mean, are you implying that Christ is not being called God here?
I'm implying that Christ doesn't have to be being called God there, or that he's not being called the God of the universe and of all things and of the eternal unbegotten one. I know you believe that the Father is the unbegotten one, but I believe that the true God alone is unbegotten. But I will say that I believe there is a distinction when an early church father puts the definite article in front of theos and when they do not. Now, it is true that theos can apply to the one true God without the article, but in this context, this is a moment where if your theology is correct, that that whole really could have made a difference here, but it's not. It's not there. And that's because, in my opinion, it's not saying that Jesus as God can be worshipped, but it's saying that Jesus as a God can be worshipped. And now
okay.
What's
I understand
also
what you're saying.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me go ahead. Okay, and I'm glad that you're actually saying that. But without going without going into saying that we need to have the article, I guess, before Christ or before beyond here, that really doesn't make any difference at all. Because I just asked you a little while ago if chapter 19 was in reference to the fact that Justin says only God is to be worshipped, and you said yes. Am I correct? Chapter 19.
I did. I agreed. Hold on. I'm sorry, William. I agreed that as long as God in that reference is to the Father alone, because and I went to the
Mr. McCabe, I understand your theology.
Yeah.
My question is in reference to Justin's theology, not yours. In chapter 19, you have said that Justin says that only the true God can be worshipped. Am I correct?
It says that, yes. It says that only God can be worshipped.
So
I do believe it.
If Justin is saying that only God can be given proskuneo, worship, and then he comes up in chapter 76, and he's saying that Christ is a God and he can be worshipped. How can that be logical, Mr. McCabe, if Justin is telling us that it's idolatry to give worship to anybody other than the true God? But he connects the Greek word proskuneo with Christ. And my question for you is this. You're trying to bring up the Greek article here. The Greek, I don't understand quite why, because we've got Christ mentioned here, and it explicitly mentioned that he is the one that is strong and to be given worship to. So my question here is really simple. Are you telling me that chapter 76 is saying that we're supposed to give a sort of worship that is idolatry to Christ?
It's not idolatry in the fact that Christ doesn't represent something innate within himself, but that any worship that goes to Jesus is to the glory of God the Father. It's by the will of the Father that Christ is worshipped, and thus worship is done not into Christ, but to the Father, the true God.
Okay, I think it's your turn to...
Okay.
So I think this is the last set of cross-exams, so... Joey, this will be your last cross-exam, and then, William, you'll have one last cross-exam, and then we'll have closing statements, and you can start now.
All right. Now we're talking about this worship thing, where you're trying to catch me in this sort of, well, Jesus is, Justin calls Jesus God, and he's worshipped God, and he says he can't be worshipped. But I think this comes from an oversimplification of the complexity of Judaic monotheism, if you ask me, where God, the only God, is the only one that can be worshipped in that. I'm sorry, I'm just talking. Let me try to finish the question. So the question is, why would you think that I'm assuming my own theology into the text? That when I specifically referred to Justin making a quote from the New Testament text.
Okay, great. Let me answer that for you. And with all due respect, Mr. McCabe, I find your theology to be rather secular, and I don't mean that in a positive manner, but because I can tell what you're trying to do, and no offense meant to be given at all. You're trying to avoid what's logical in Justin. And I'm trying to hammer home the point that in his chapter 19 of his first apology, what he's doing here is the point really isn't even, and I want to make it clear for people listening, the point really isn't even that he's telling us, hey, you worship God alone. No, really, Justin's, he's upset. He's saying, hey, you worship God alone. You give this worship to anybody else, and that's idolatry. So he's really saying, hey, the greatest commandment is you give worship, all of it, all that you got in your potential, in your heart, in your soul, you give that to God, the one true God. And then we go down to chapter 76. We go to the chapter where he says that David predicted, and that he says that Christ is strong and to be worshipped, that he is God, strong and to be worshipped. And logic entails, to me, Mr. McCabe, logic really entails that if Justin is saying that worship is not to be given to anybody but God, and then you're saying that he's giving worship to Christ, but Christ is a God. That would be idolatry, because in Justin's theology, true worship is due to the true God alone. So if you're going to try and say, okay, well, guess what? Christ is a tiny God, but he's due worship. Well, then you're going against what Justin says, and you're actually falling into the category of the people that Justin's getting upset at. He's saying it's idolatry to give worship to anybody but the true God, and later on he tells us the true God is Christ. So I find that to be the most logical answer, and really I'm not reading into anything. We can throw out all the Greek articles in the world. We can throw out the Greek word proskuneo. We can stick to the English alone, and it is clear in the English. His logic is Christ is God, to be worshipped. Anybody other than the true God is idolatry.
Okay. I'm just going to move on from that because I think we've exhausted that topic. I'm going to go on to this idea of the eternal generation of the Son. And I want to go first to the beginning chapters of the dialogue between Justin and I believe it's a different philosopher, in which case they're talking about the begotten state of the universe and the unbegotten and incorruptible. And I wanted to ask you in reference to chapter 5 of the dialogue.
Chapter 5. Let me pull that up.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You can go ahead and ask me the question. I pulled it up already.
Okay. Actually, I'm going to start a little above that. Chapter 5 is pretty much all is a pretty good thing.
So about the soul, you're referring to the dialogue with Trifle, right? The passage where he's dialoguing with an old man?
Yes.
Okay,
so,
sure.
What I find interesting about this passage is that we find some things that I would never expect to be predicated in the regards to what I'm saying. Now you talk a lot about you follow the logic where it leads, this and that. I believe that the doctrine of the Trinity is absurd by definition, but I believe that it can only mean this and that because I follow a logical formula of how
I understand cross-examination. So to make a sweeping statement like that, I'm going to answer that. If you think that it is illogical to believe in the Trinity, that's.
Well, William, let Joey ask his question.
Okay.
I didn't mean to prompt any anger there. I just was trying.
No, it's no anger, but I know it's cross-examination, and you're making statements.
Okay. My apologies. Let me continue. Okay. So, what does it mean when Justin and the other old man are dialoguing? In which case, it said, "That which always maintains the same nature and in the same nature, and is the cause of all other things. That indeed is God." What do you think is being said? What do you think is being meant by what's being said here?
Is that God causes everything to come into existence?
Okay. So, do you believe that Jesus has a cause?
What do you mean a cause? In his human form or in his form of deity? No, I believe in deity.
Any form. Do you believe that Jesus has a cause of something?
I think you're going to have to define what you mean by cause. Like, do you mean a beginning? A beginning, I think you mean, right? A beginning?
Well,
like, did he come to be? I'm trying to understand what you're asking. Like, do you mean, like, does he have a beginning, like as if he came into be, like came into existence?
Oh boy!
Okay.
Really?
Well, this will be the last cross-exam. So,
okay.
William, you cross-exam Joey, and this will be the last, and then Joey has a closing statement, and then William, you have a closing statement, and then we'll take listeners' questions. So you can begin now.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and I'll start now. Joey, can you open up the Bible to Exodus chapter 3, verse 16? And I'll go ahead and I'll read that as you try and get there. It says, I'm going to read the NIV version. Even though I don't really like the New International Version, I'm going to read it. Go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. If you can go ahead and let me know whenever you get to that passage.
I'm right there.
Okay, great. Is this text referring to the true God?
In
Exodus 3:15.
Now, are you asking? Okay, let me say two things. I would say that one, I believe that this is in reference to the Judaic true God. I'm an agnostic, so I'm not one to believe that the two testaments don't contradict. But I am to say that this is a reference to the true God. But I understand what you're going to say. In relation to what first century Christians believed, I would say that this is not a reference to the true God.
Okay. So you're telling me that okay, well, I guess let me try and make that clear. You don't believe what first century Christians say, but my question to you really has nothing to do with them. I'm asking you, if Exodus 3:16, according to Judaic theology, is this referencing the true God? Is the true God the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Is that the true God in this passage?
That is the true God to the Jews, yes.
Okay, so that is not the true God for everybody, only for the Jews?
Yes.
Okay. In Justin's dialogue, can we go to chapter 59? It's a really short little paragraph.
59. I can do this. All right.
Okay. Are you there?
Is it a short paragraph?
It's a very short paragraph.
Oh, you're just talking about the paragraph, not the chapter itself. Okay, gotcha.
Okay. In chapter 59 of Justin's dialogue with Trypho, the Jew, to whom does Justin apply this verse? Is he applying this verse about the true God to the Father or to the Son?
He's applying it to the Son.
Okay. Mr. McCabe, if Justin applies this historical text to the Son, as you've just agreed, a text which was historically understood to be a reference to the true God, is it then logical to believe that he viewed the Son as true God?
I only believe that would be of the case if I didn't believe Justin was contradicting the Old Testament, as I do.
I understand what you're saying. You believe Justin is contradicting the Old Testament, or I mean, I imagine that's what you're saying. But regardless of whatever Justin is contradicting, we're talking about Justin Martyr's theology.
Okay.
He's applying this text to the Son, right?
Yes, he is.
And this text is in reference to the true God, am I correct?
It's I wouldn't say for Justin it was a reference to the true God.
Oh, okay. So, Mike, I guess that brings my next question about the God of the fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That is not the true God to Justin?
The Father is not, in this context, the Father is not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So, in this passage, Justin is referring to, like, I guess, a kind of deity, I suppose. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, he's referring to another deity, another God, the second God.
Okay. Does Justin say anywhere in this chapter that this is a different type of God he's referring to?
He doesn't say anything in this chapter about a different God, but he does throughout the rest of his writings talk about the second God. In fact, I believe it's before this that he actually says that the thesis of what's being said here is in relation to Trypho saying, prove to me that there is indeed a second God besides the maker of all things.
Okay, so in this passage, in chapter 59 of Justin's dialogue, when he says, the Lord God of your fathers, the Lord God of your fathers is not referencing a God of old. It's referencing Christ who just came about in human form.
It's yes, it's referencing the second God, which is Christ.
Okay, so you do believe Christ has been eternal, or you don't believe Christ was eternal God?
I do not believe Jesus is the eternal God.
When do you believe Jesus came into existence?
Sometime prior to creation.
Okay. Does Justin believe that Christ was not eternal?
I believe he makes interesting statements. I believe that he is not eternal, yes.
Okay, that's
all right,
the
gentlemen.
my process.
That wraps up the cross exams. Just really thank you guys for really conducting yourself well, and we're going to have our closing statements now. And Joey, you have 7 minutes closing statement, and then William has 7 minutes, and then we're going to open up the lines for the listeners to ask you guys some questions. So, Joey, you can start now.
All right. Well, this has been fun. I thought I wasn't really going to be prepared, but I feel that I've been able to supply myself with a good amount of evidence. Now, I just wanted to add a little bit more into what I was talking about being begotten, what it means to be caused. Elsewhere in Justin Martyr's writings, we find that Jesus has a cause. Now, we're not really told what that cause is or what that cause is in relation to, but that Jesus has a cause. And that only one being exists that has no cause. There's only one ultimate source of existence. As understood in Justin Martyr, in the Theology of Justin Martyr by Erwin Goodenough, he claims that there are two gods, but only one source, only one ultimate existence. And then he makes a reference to angels, which is interesting because he says such permanent, and he's referring to the fact that how Jesus is in relation to the Father, and how in fact he is the rays as if he were the sun, he's the water or the flame as if it were kindled, and I'm going to talk about that a little in just a few minutes. But what in relation, Erwin Goodenough says, such permanent overflows are the angels of permanent existence, but though permanent, they have no independent existence and represent no abscission from the source. Now, this is interesting because William seems to think that because the Father there wasn't a dividing of substance of the Father, that somehow means that Jesus is the true God. I happen to agree that the Father was not divided in substance, as if an apple, where you were to take a bite out of an apple, in which case the apple is divided in substance. In fact, I believe Trinitarianism does exactly that. It divides the substance of the Father, because the Father at once was the only true God, and now they've split him. They've split God, the Father of all things, into three separate deities or persons. They'll deny deities, but I believe that the logical conclusion is that they're all deities. But essentially, I want to move on to now the idea of flame and kindling the flame, and this idea of Jesus as the same. What's interesting also is that a lot of Trinitarians import what I would say extra-biblical theology in an explanation to say why Jesus Christ is the same. They invoke his human nature, basically. None of the early church fathers do this for some reason. And it's because I don't believe Jesus had dual natures. I believe when it says Jesus is the same, that he is metaphorically the same, in that whatever he represents will always be the same. Not that he himself is the same, where he can't change and he can't do this and do that. In fact, I think Justin absolutely affirms that he can change. And sometimes he's an angel, sometimes he's God, sometimes he's a stone, sometimes he's a ruler, all these different things. Where we in fact see a change happening. And in reference to the kindling of the fire and the eternal generation of the Son, not only do I believe the idea of eternal generation is absurd, but in relation to the kindling, was there a time when the second fire was not? Yes, there was. So is Justin saying that in fact Jesus did have a beginning? In which case the second God, as told to us by Justin Martyr, is in fact became or began to exist at some point previous to all of creation? and I want to define what I mean by creation. When I say something's created, I am defining it as if it were created through Christ. So all things are created because they're done through Christ. Now, Jesus, in that regard, is not created because Jesus is not created through Christ. He's created in a different. He came into being in a different manner, which I would say is he was begotten. He was begotten at the beginning, as Justin says, before the creation of all things, and all things is all physical realities. It might necessarily not even include the angels in all things, but nonetheless, I believe that Jesus did have. Jesus did have a beginning. So I think that there's a lot of assumptions going on here, maybe on both sides, and I think that also William does a good job of representing and knowing the Greek and everything like that. But I also believe he assumes a Trinitarian position from the outset and imports later theology into the text of Justin. Now, I just read a new book called The Angel of the Lord, or the Great Angel, and it basically says that Jesus is Jehovah, but that Jehovah is not the Father. And this is basically what I was going for when I was talking with William about who the true God is, where the true God is not Jehovah. Jehovah is not the true God. This is very different theology than any of us believed. It's a very interesting book, The Great Angel by Margaret Baxton, I think. I'm not really sure, but anyway. In conclusion, I want to thank William and Augustine for allowing me the time to explain what I think about Justin Martyr and why he was a Unitarian. I also want to thank our listeners for calling in. In conclusion, I want to make a few points also. It's easy to make a passage say what you want it to say. It's easy to distort what the Bible or other writers say. It's hard to translate ancient languages in a way that appropriately represents the view of the people long ago. There's so much information required to come to an understanding of exactly what Justin meant when he said things about what Jesus was. In my research, I read Plato's Timaeus, some of Albinus, the Stoics' work. I read some of Philo of Alexandria and his concept of the Logos. I read other church fathers in relation to Jesus. So what should we assume about Jesus? Unlike the Bible for Christians, just as is allowed, Justin is allowed to contradict. He's allowed to say wrong things. So maybe Justin, in fact, when in reference to Christ being worshipped, said something wrong. Maybe he didn't really mean that. Maybe he didn't really mean to say that. Maybe he's contradicting something he said before. Either way, I believe it doesn't really matter because I can explain away both positions. Dang it. All right. Well, I want to thank Augustine for keeping me on here for a bit, and I'm just happy that we were able to have an exchange of sophistication and professionality and all sorts of stuff. So, William, go for your closing.
Okay, great. William, you can begin with your closing statement right now.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. McCabe, and thank you, Gus, for being a great moderator as usual. I want to go ahead and touch upon a few things that we went over in the debate. And I think that we saw a lot of analogies that Justin made. And one thing that I want to be clear about is that Justin was very, very meticulous in the Greek words in which he employed. And one comment, a few points that Joey was saying in regards to the eternal generation of the Son. So I've got to really, really disagree with him, because Justin is clear when he says that, and he makes an analogy of fire. He says, which is not lessened when it is kindled another, but remains the same. And that which has been kindled by it likewise appears to exist by itself, not diminishing that from which it was kindled. The word of wisdom, the Logos, who is himself this God, begotten of the Father of all things, and word and wisdom and power and the glory of the begetter. Taking to mind again, as I mentioned earlier, that the chapter was in reference to the generation of Christ, the Logos. And Justin uses an example of Christ by saying the fire isn't lessened when it comes about. In this case, when Christ came to earth in human form. So his analogy is that this fire existed in some form before it came to earth in the human form. It pre-existed. But what is most interesting about Justin, and again, people might say, it's tough to really translate the Greek. It really isn't when you've got one really simple word here, the Greek word monontos. He tells us that the fire remains the same. So Christ existed before, now he comes in human form, and since he's God, he remains the same. We know this because following this example, he tells us that the word of wisdom, who is in himself God. Okay, this is the kind of God that Christ is. But what kind of a God? A God that is deserving of worship, a God that is strong, and a God that in his God essence has never changed. God does not change. Generation is eternal because Justin believes he was sent by the Father just before the creation of the world. But does this mean that he was created or came about before the creation of the world? No. And again, Justin says that his source is deity, and his source does not change and remains the same. This is a key in understanding what Justin is trying to say. And I would recommend anybody search the usage of the term monontos in the Septuagint, the New Testament. He's literally saying that Christ's deity is eternal and never changing. Mr. McCabe then says that chapter 76 of Justin's dialogue needs the article. It needs the article. In order for Justin to be saying that Christ is God here, we need that Greek article. I don't know how many times I've heard Jehovah's Witnesses bring up the Greek article. And in this instance, it is one of the most confusing arguments I have heard put forth in regards to Justin. Because, excuse me, I apologize. I did not have the Greek text open in front of me when I was going over the passage earlier. But I was able to pull the Greek text, and we literally read, kai theon. We have the conjunction, kai theon. And then we have this connecting it with worship. Of who? Of Christ. Okay. So let me try and make a really simple guideline here for you. Chapter 19 of Justin's first apology, Mr. McCabe agreed with me. We are to worship God alone. Literally, the Greek tells us worship God alone. Han, theon, manon. That means one simple thing. You don't worship anybody but the true God. You worship anybody else, and you are committing idolatry. There is no alternate meaning for the word monos. None. So what then does Justin mean when he tells us that David predicted Christ would be born from the womb and that he was God, strong and to be worshipped? We see that Christ is to be worshipped here. So he followed the logic where Justin is telling us that it is idolatry to give worship to any other than God. If Justin believed that Christ was a God with a tiny g, he would be advocating idolatry by saying that Christ is God and to be worshipped. Because he already said that only God, only the true God is due worship. So guess what? If we're to give Christ worship, I don't care how many Unitarians in the world want to say that Justin was saying, oh, he's just a tiny God, or Christ is a God. You can translate that as a God because of the missing article or what have you. All of those fancy arguments aren't going to cloak the Unitarians when it comes to the Church Fathers. They might help when it comes to biblical passages that might not be so clear, but when it comes to the Church Fathers who elucidate exactly what they mean, it is not going to work. Because Justin tells us only the true God is due worship. So if only the true God is due worship, and we're told that Christ is due worship because he's God and he's strong, and you want to tell me that he's a different kind of God, a smaller kind of deity, I'm sorry, but that's not Justin's theology. The Greek term monos indicates that only God is to be worshipped, not another smaller God or qualified deity, but the true God. In fact, he ties that in with saying that the greatest commandment is to worship the Lord your God. Is it then logical to assume that since only the true God can be worshipped in Justin's theology, that this entails that Justin viewed Christ as true God? Absolutely. Exodus 3:16, come on. Who's Justin dialoguing with? We know very well Justin stuck to most of his quotations from the Old Testament. Why? Because he's dialoguing with a Jew. He's talking to the Jews here. The Jews knew who the God was of Exodus 3:16. That's their true God. That is the true God. The Jews knew that. So when he tells them, this is the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, He's talking about the true God. He's talking to a Jew. And the Jews knew just what he was saying. Hey, this guy's talking to us about Christ, their God. And he's true God. He's being mentioned as true God here. He applies this verse not to the Father, but to the Son. A historical text that has been historically understood to be a reference to the true God, doesn't matter if you're agnostic, was given reference to Christ. And I want to thank Mr. McCabe for his time and Gus for being a great moderator as usual. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen. That ends the debate, and we're going to open up the lines for people that are listening online. If you're listening online and not by phone, and you want to ask a question of Joey or William, please let us know who you want to ask the question. If you want to ask both of those gentlemen the same question, please indicate so. The number is 347-934-0379. That's 347-934-0379, and press 1 so that I can see you on the switchboard. So if you have any questions for Joey McCabe or William Albrecht, please press 1, and this will be the time to do so. If I don't see you guys pressing 1, I'm going to ask some questions because I got to be a filler for this time. We got 30 minutes, so you guys got actually more time to go ahead and ask your questions. Yeah. So. People just press 1 so that I can see you. I see some people coming on the line, and maybe you're just coming on the line just to listen. But if you're coming on the line to ask a question, I'm just going to repeat myself. Press 1 so that I can see you, so you can ask Joey or William a question. The number is 347-934-0379. So I don't see anybody pressing any 1s. Come on now. And yet I see you guys right there on the switchboard. Oh, there we go. All righty, number 830, you're on the air.
Okay.
Hello, you're on the air, 830.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. This question is actually for both William and Mr. McAbee. My question is, in regards to, did Justin ever refer to Jesus as like an angel or some kind of other being?
Right.
I mean, like not human, spiritual, anything other than the deity, I guess, is what I'm trying to find out.
You want to ask if Justin referred to Jesus as an angel?
As an angel, yeah, or some kind of like...
Yeah, and you want to ask that to both gentlemen, right?
Yes, to both gentlemen.
Okay, Joey, you can go ahead and shoot at that.
The question is, did Justin believe Jesus was an angel?
Right.
Yes.
I would believe. I'm very on the fence about this because I don't believe. Because there are some things in
I got to mute you because there's a lot of background noise.
What do you want to say?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Joey.
Okay. Because I believe that there are points where Jesus is actually included in the title of angels, such as we see in his first apology, chapter 6, where he actually calls Jesus a part of the host of the other good angels, and other in that regard is of like kind. But then, of course, we see him referred to as a god. Then we see sometimes where he's called God. So I would essentially say that it's quite confusing to really know what Jesus is, like what he is. Now, I would say angels can be called God, and we see that from many Old Testament texts, and even other humans can be called gods in New Testament texts. But I believe, nonetheless, that Jesus is an angel in the fact that he is out of the Father, that he does the will of the Father, is the messenger of him, and is not the Father or the true God himself.
And William, how would you answer that question?
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I'll answer it, and I'm going to go ahead and agree and disagree with Mr. McCabe. I agree that Justin is not calling Christ an angel in the sense of, in the sense of the choir of angels or the angels in heaven, in that sense. when Justin refers to Christ as angel, he's really clear and calculated in his usage of the term angelos. And he's referencing the fact that he believed Christ had been a messenger. And in fact, he makes a lot of analogies in the sense that Christ came down from heaven. Since he believed Christ had been an eternal God, he believes Christ came down and he was sent by the Father in human form as a sort of angel, as a messenger of the gospel, a messenger of the good news. And he had he mentions that a number of times, but in reference to him saying that Christ was indeed an angel in the sense that we view St. Michael or other angels. No, he was not referring to him as an angel in that sense. He was referring to him as an angel in the sense of a messenger sent to spread the good news. I hope that helps answer your question.
Okay. All right, we have another caller with the same area code. It looks like you got a bunch of people from your area there calling, William. Caller 830, you're on the air.
Hello?
Hello, yes, you're on the air.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Albrecht, and I just want to ask, did Justin ever call Christ a different type of God?
Okay.
Okay, it's actually a really good question. No, the answer is really, it's not as simple as just saying no. Actually, it is, but it's more in-depth than that. He does not call Christ a different type of God. One thing that we're going to find amongst Justin really, really prevalent in Justin's writings is sometimes when he's trying to differentiate between the Father and the Son, his best manner in which, in doing that, was sometimes saying, this is God and this is the Son, and sometimes saying this is God and this is the second person of the Trinity. Not Trinity, I doesn't use that word, but he's differentiating between God the Father and God the Son. So his language isn't always very developed as it would develop later in later years and later centuries actually. But he's really clear in what he says and the fact that he believes Christ to have been the true God. But I think one other point I want to make is he's also not very clear a lot of the times when he's referring to the Father, because he limits himself to a number of terms when he's referencing the Father, God the Father and God the Son. Sometimes he refers to God exclusively as God to differentiate between God the Father and God the Son. And sometimes he pretty much limits himself to using the term Lord for God the Father and then a different term for God the Son. But regardless of how he attempts to differentiate, his theology of the Logos, of Christ, was really simple. As we saw in his chapter 19 of his work, and in many other parts, I just keyed on that one area, is he was clear that he believed he believed only God should be worshipped, and he tells us in many places that Christ is to be worshipped because he believes Christ to have been the true God. I hope that gets to the heart of the question. Sorry for being so long.
Okay. I don't see any more ones. Just letting the callers know, 347-934-0379, and press 1 if you have a question. Until I see a caller pop up, I do have a question. I have a question for Joey. Joey.
One second. Can I just make a response back
Sure.
to that question as well, or do you just want to move on?
Go ahead. If you want to, go ahead and give your opinion on that.
Okay. I just wanted to say that for that last caller, I love that you asked that question, because that definitely is my point. The whole point of my thesis of presenting the Father as a God and Jesus as a God. And I wanted to just give in chapter 56 of the dialogue between Justin and Typhro, me and a colleague of mine who speaks Greek came up with this translation, and I thought it was quite significant in relation to the point and the answer to your question. And it came up to because this particular one is called a God and a Lord, yet is another numerically of a different kind and quality, and that references to the Greek word heteros, and inferior to the maker of the entire universe, which means he's lower than him, not equal to. who is also called an angel, through whom messages to mankind are announced concerning whatever is willed by the maker of the universe, above whom there is no other God numerically of the same kind and quality. And I think that this does a great differentiation between the type of God Jesus is and the type of God the true God is, where Jesus is a different kind of God, numerically distinct and qualitatively different than the Father, and that there are no other gods numerically of the same kind and quality as the Father.
Okay. I just letting everybody know, I'm always going to defer to other people. Number is 347-934-0379. Press 1 if you want to ask a question. And I see people on the switchboard, but nobody's pressing 1. So I'm going to ask, I have actually 2 questions for you, Joey. It probably would make things a lot easier if we just got a letter A before God all the time when there's not a definite article, right? I was thinking, are you of the opinion that whenever there's not a definite article, that translators have woefully mistranslated, including the patristics, without including an indefinite article? So are you of the opinion that we should have an indefinite article wherever there's no definite article present in describing the theos?
No, I'm not of that opinion, but I also want to clear out that there is no indefinite article in Greek. But not that I think you said that, but just to be sure.
Right. I was wondering if just because in the debate that you brought up the issue about theos. So do you believe that the term theos without the definite article can actually apply to the true God?
It can, and it is, but it's never understood by the grammar alone. It needs to be understood contextually, where what kind of God which God is being talked about is basically when the ho is not there. What God are we talking about? So then the context plays into a very, very big role of who exactly is being spoken about. But my point is this: that if you wanted to say that Jesus was God in Greek, it's very easy. It's very easy to say it. One, don't call if he's a member of God, such as a person of the a person of the Trinity, then don't call him God, because he's not really God, because God is the Trinity. He's a person of God. Call him that. He's a second something else. He's not the God of which he is a part of. Because when I am referring to the God, I mean God when I say God, a personal, distinct, almighty being, person, singular. That's why we see I's and he's applied to God when in reference to him, and that's why I was talking to William about to him alone you should worship. Well, who's the him? If God is a multiplication of people, then it should really say they. If it's talking about if it's referencing the being of God, and not his person or persons, because God doesn't really have a person; he has 3 persons. So that's really what I'm getting at when I'm talking about a God, where the God is distinguished from God without the article, meaning that something else needs to play a part in how we translate it and how we define it.
You actually said something in the debate that I thought was interesting. You described God as a description of nature, and so if God is a description of nature, couldn't the term God be used to different persons of God, just like the term human can describe a singular person, and yet it can also apply to many persons. You have, unfortunately, I think the limitation of that, and when we're talking about humanity, is the fact that we say humans as a plurality of many persons of that type of being. So I was, I just thought that was interesting that you said that in the debate. But the other question I do have to ask, and I just want to remind our listeners, 347-934-0379. If you have a question for Joey or William, please press 1. Is that you brought up the issue of proskuneo, and we know that there are two words described worship in the Bible. One is proskuneo, the other one is latreo, or latria. So are you of the opinion that whenever proskuneo is applied, it doesn't imply divine worship or exclusive worship, and that we have to use the word latreo in order to describe exclusive divine worship?
I don't think it really matters, because I believe latreo and proskuneo can have different semantic structures in relation to their transliteration the translation into English. But I think that it's important to understand that when we say we can only worship God, or we can only give God latreo, that when I say God, I'm not including other persons in that. I'm talking about one person, and it's the Father. Now, and I think that the him, or the personal pronoun there, the singular personal pronoun in reference to the him of God, is interesting. It's basically a fault of, or I guess a problem for both positions. But I mean, William disagrees that it's a reference to the Father alone, but I think that it is. And I think that I've done my best to prove why. But in that regard, then we have to understand, if we're going to say that the Bible doesn't contradict, which I don't hold to that position, but if I were a Christian who believes that, I would have to believe that there were a different semantic structure to how we say and do something, such as, say I say, oh, my boss, I work at Best Buy, my boss said that I have to do this. And then I say, I only have one boss. And then you say, oh, well, your CEO? What about your CEO? Oh, well, he's my boss of a different kind. He's the boss of my boss. So that's kind of the idea that we're getting here, where I'm sorry, go ahead.
In relation to my question, though, are you of the opinion then that latreo can be applied to other persons other than the one true Creator?
Yes. It could if it were.
Do you have an example?
I don't, but that wasn't really the question. It was just, can it be? But if it were, can it be? And I say yes, it could be.
You think that that other persons can have divine worship applied to them that is not false worship?
Correct.
Because, for example, I would say that, for example, I believe that the devil does receive latreo. I believe that the devil receives sacred service. That's what the New World Translation translates it as, or divine worship applied to him. But of course, that is false worship because it's applied to the devil.
It's not.
So would you be of the opinion that latreo, divine worship, can be applied to other persons and yet not be false worship? So that would add to that question then, I guess.
It's not that because Satan is worshipped, that it's false worship. It's the fact that it's not ordained in that regard. Right. So I would say that Jesus said, no, I'm not going to worship you because it's not right to worship you, because someone tells me it's not right to worship you. Now, when we say that, when we say we should worship God alone, there's a thing in Justin Martyr's writings where he actually talks about abrogation, where actually when Jesus came, he abrogated the law, including the Sabbath, where that Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments, where, in fact, you can actually not do work. Now you can do work on the Sabbath. It's just interesting. So I would definitely extrapolate that and say that perhaps this kind of worship, or latreo in this sense, could also be approbated, where the Father no longer requires that only He be worshipped, and can in fact ordain that someone else other than himself can be worshipped, just like we see in Hebrews, I believe it is, where it says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." So I think that's just one of the explanations that we can have for how can another being be worshipped and not be the true God.
Now, the scripture you quoted, though, is proskuneo, not latreo, though. Well, it's Hebrews chapter 1, I believe, verse 4 or 5, I believe. Let all the angels worship him. It's proskuneo. So that's why I said, could you cite an example where God has, in a positive manner, allowed for other creatures to receive latreo worship? Now, I'm not denying that passage you quoted is divine worship, even though the word proskuneo is described. But I'm just curious if you had an example where latreo is used of other than God in a positive manner as far as true worship is concerned for others.
I don't have an example, but I mean, I guess, but you have to also think it's not because I don't have an example that it nullifies the position. It's the fact that Jesus might be the example, where he's a person other than the Father who's given latreo. So I think that's and what if there's only one other who's allowed to worship, who's been worshipped in that way? Jesus, the only begotten God, is the only other God besides the Father who can be worshipped. In which case, I wouldn't be able to give you another example because Jesus is the concept, and Jesus as the concept of the true God is what's being debated here. I believe that Jesus, it's proven that others can worship something other than God because Jesus is other than God, but you believe only God can be worshipped, and therefore that makes Jesus God. So there's an assumption on both parts here of where there's a specific splitting. I'm not splitting God, while the Trinitarian side is, and I mean that in the most tasteful way, where splitting means separating him into three divine persons, all eternal, co-equal, stuff like that. But I believe he's one being, and that Jesus is another being.
Right. I'll tell you that. That it's interesting because, and I'm just going to make a quick statement right here. To me, I think you see the Trinity as an innovation that is, as an innovation, and it's funny, and yet a Trinitarian would view your idea that creature worship is allowed as an innovation. So you regard one as an acceptable innovation and the other one as an unacceptable innovation, and so I think that's an interesting theory that you have there about because you use the example of Jesus abrogating the Sabbath, and I'm not necessarily sure whether he actually abrogated the Sabbath or whether he just regarded, the Sabbath, I guess, was made for men to rest and a day of worship for God. I'm not sure if he abrogated or if he just morphed it into something else, which is, I think that's a whole nother debate and issue, probably with an Adventist. But, which we were supposed to have this month with an Adventist, but we'll possibly have it in July or August with William debating an Adventist. But let me just let the listeners 347-934-0379. Please press 1 because we're down to the last 6 minutes of the program, and I don't want to say I told you so because our listeners always wait till the last minute, and then all of a sudden I see 1111, and it's like 1 minute left, and believe me, it cuts off at 2 hours. So, and I cut off at 2 hours because I got to go someplace. So, if anybody has a question to ask, please press 1.
Could I make a quick comment, Gus?
Sure, go ahead.
Comment? I wanted to comment earlier about in reference to the article. I think you made a really good point that the article isn't always a necessity. And I think that I remember earlier we were talking about, I believe it was chapter 76. Yes, chapter 76. First, we were speaking about chapter 19, the Apology, and there we went over the fact that Justin tells us that we believe that worship is to be given to the true God alone. And then we read where Justin is telling us that he believes Christ has been strong and deserving of worship. I just wanted to point out one thing in case some people were listening, even though I did say it in my closing statement, that regardless of any article, in the Greek, if we can see that the phrases are being connected, and we can see they're connected here with the conjunction kai, which is clear, it's even clear in the English or whatever other language, who's being referred to here is God, and Christ is being connected as being God here. I think that one thing that I would recommend the audience do, because, of course, as even Joey will admit, we really just don't have enough time, is to go over the amount of times Justin uses theos. And you're going to find, and I would recommend you don't just go over them, read the context. And you're going to find rich, what I would call Orthodox theology highlighted in the early church. And I would recommend everybody hears our quotations we bring about and whatever arguments we raise. But again, I think the early church is full of rich historical insights. And I would recommend anybody really read Justin's works and get a full view of what he's really saying.
You know, I think that also. I think that's key, and reading any piece of literature is not just grammar. And I think that we always overly concentrate on grammar, but I just look at the setting, and I think that what's critical to Martyr's discussion there is that he's speaking to a Jew, and so
very critical.
I think that we all need to keep in mind he's talking to a Jew who believes only the Father is God, and this discussion about Jesus Christ is taking place, including angel Christology. That is, and when I make a reference to angel Christology, I'm talking about Jesus being present in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord, Yahweh, whatever. And so I think that that's something that we all need to keep in mind when it comes to reading Justin Martyr. Remember, he's talking to a Jew who believes this, and this, he's a staunch exclusivist. It's different from a Trinitarian, different from even Joey's position, which is more of a form of henotheism. This Jew believes, the Shema is the Lord our God is only one Lord, and he only believes it is Yahweh. And so I think that's something to keep in mind in all three of our readings of Martyr, and to keep that in mind. We're down to the last 2 minutes of the program. I just want to thank both of you guys for conducting yourselves so well, and this could be a precursor to future debates. And and Joey, I think you did well for your first debate, and I think what's really, really critical is that once you get a flavor or a feel for professional debate, you'll become better and better at it. You get the time constraints, and then you'll learn how to do things within a certain time limit.
Yeah.
So I just encourage you to continue on in professional moderated debates and listen to other debates. And there's a great movie called The Great Debaters. I think that's a great. Anyone who's interested in going into moderated debates, it's about racism, but it's a really great movie about the first black debate team, and gives us an idea of what moderated debate was about. So, everyone, see you guys next week, 12 noon. We're going to have Wayne, and he is an agnostic, and he's going to be on the show, and he's a former Jehovah's Witness, and he's going to share his story. And we just thank everyone. See, somebody hit one, right? We're about to 42 seconds left. I'm sorry I can't get you. But be sure to listen next week, 12 noon, and listen to Wayne share his story and ask him some questions. So You all have a great Memorial Day weekend. Remember your veterans and those that have passed on for our lives. So God bless everyone. We'll see you next week on Healing X Outreach Radio. God bless. Bye-bye.